the lights of someone else's ethics and morals. Because that's what Chanukah is meant to remind us. Make sure those lights are a reflection of who we really are. But I felt that it was important pre-Chanukah to give a little bit of a introduction to Chanukah and a little bit of a reminder of what Chanukah is about. So I'm always not sure whether I should do that or not do that, but based on the conversation that I had with Marty on a little bit earlier today, I realized that my choice. This is not a put down in any way, but I just realized that based on some of the things he was sharing with me about someone else's perspective on what Chanukah is, I felt that it really is critical and necessary to chazer over, to review what Chanukah is and what it's meant to mean to us and what we're meant to see in the lights that we light on Chanukah. Okay, much of the thoughts that I'm going to say are based on an idea that's taught by Rav Pinchas Friedman, who is called the Shvilei Pinchas, a contemporary Torah teacher and author, a Belzer Chassid, and with a very beautiful perspective. And I want to share that perspective and then apply it to our lives. Let's start with this past week's parsha. So we know that when Yosef got thrown into the pit, so the Torah tells us that v'habor reik ve'ein bo mayim, that the pit was empty and that there was no water inside. So Rashi comments immediately. He says, wait a second. Once you tell me that the pit was empty and that there was no water in the pit, so then the pit was empty. I know that there was no water in the pit. And if that's the case, then why do you have to tell me that there was no water? No, just tell me that the pit was empty, habor reik. And I can make the next understanding. I can extrapolate and say, well, if the pit was empty, that means that there was no water. Why did you have to tell me that the bor reik ve'ein bo mayim, the pit was empty and there was no water? Because Rashi says mayim ein bo, because there was no water, but there were nechashim and akravim, but there were snakes and scorpions inside the pit, and therefore Joseph was saved from the snakes and scorpions. Now the truth is, the brothers had no idea that there were snakes and scorpions in the pit. The brothers couldn't see that far down into the pit. They had no idea. And if that's the case, so then if there were snakes and scorpions in the pit, and they were in the crevices in the pit, they were in the bottom of the pit, then why do I need to know that? If you want to teach me that Yosef was saved from these wild beasts, then the brothers had no idea that it was there, because had the brothers known that they were there, then the brothers would never have harmed him further. Because the brothers would have said, how could we go after Joseph? God saved him from the snakes and scorpions that are there. And God didn't want them to back off. So they had no idea that there were snakes and scorpions there. If that's the case, why did there need to be snakes and scorpions there? What does that add to me to know that there was no water, but there was snakes and scorpions? The snakes and scorpions are not an important part of the story. They don't need to be there. Because the fact that he was saved from them doesn't figure in the story. It doesn't make a difference, because the brothers had no idea that he was saved from that. So if that's the case, why was it necessary to set up this whole thing that when he was thrown into the pit, there were snakes and scorpions in the bottom of the pit? Why did there need to be snakes and scorpions? That's problem number one. Problem number two is that a similar question, but that if you're going to tell me that Yosef was going to be saved anyway because God wanted him to be able to be sold down to Mitzrayim, he didn't want him to die. So if that's the case, then why is it that God had to create these kinds of circumstances where there would be snakes and scorpions, he would be saved from them, and then eventually he would get sold down to Mitzrayim? That's my questions on the pit being empty and Yosef being thrown into a pit with snakes and scorpions. But to understand this, we need to understand something amazing. There is a commentary called the Megala Amukos, and he is a Kabbalistic commentary on the Torah. And he says that the exile in Yavan, in Greece. Now, it's called Galus Yavan, the Greek exile. But the truth is that when the Syrian Greeks took over the land of Israel, we stayed in the land of Israel. We weren't kicked out of the land. When the Romans took over, we were kicked out. When the Babylonians took over, we were kicked out. But when the Syrian Greeks were there, the temple was still there technically. It was a building, but it was their building. And it wasn't, it didn't have the sanctity that it had beforehand, and that they ran us. They made decrees. They did all the things that that we know about the story of Chanukah, but that they were in charge. But it was called nevertheless Golus Yavan, the exile of Greece. Says the Megala Amukos that this exile was a kapara, it was an atonement for the sale of Joseph, and that in fact, if you take the numerical value of the name Yosef and the word Melech Yavan, king of Greece, and the name of the king of Greece, which is Antioches, they all have the same numerical value. As a matter of fact, the Bnei Yissaschar, another great Hasidic commentary, says that Antiochus, that Antiochus is the same gematria, same numerical value, which is like very interesting. It's very interesting to know that they all share the same numerical value, which means that there's some kind of connection between them. But what is the connection? How could you say that Yavan is a kapara, is in any kind of way an atonement for what happened with Yosef? What in the world is the connection between Yavan and Yosef, between Greece and Joseph? What is the connection between Antiochus and Joseph that they should share the same gematria? Do I really care? But it actually goes even deeper. Because when the world was created, the Torah tells us, "V'choshech al panei tehom," that there was darkness on the face of the deep. And the commentaries say, what was that metaphorically referring to? Darkness on the face of the deep of the world? That was referring to Yavan. It was referring to Greece, because Greece was known as darkness. Why was Greek known as darkness? Because shehichshicha eineim shel Yisrael b'gzerosein, because they darkened the eyes of the Jewish people with their decrees, that they would say to them, right on the horn of an ox, that I have no portion in the God of Israel. Now, why would they say right on the horn of an ox? In the simplest understanding, it's because the horn of an ox was like the back bumper of a car. It was like a bumper sticker, because the oxen they would travel with, they would use them to plow the fields. They were very common around the town. And therefore, if you saw the horns of an ox, and on the horns of an ox it said, we have no portion in the God of Israel, we deny and cut ourselves off from the God of Israel, that's going to have an effect on people. But you have to ask a question. Why didn't they just put up signs? Why didn't they just paint it on the front door of your house? Why was it necessary to write it on the horns of an ox? Well, it happens to be that when Jacob died, he gave a blessing to all of his children. And the blessing that he gave to his son Joseph was he likened him to an ox. And Bechor Shoro Hadarlo. And if that's the case, what Greece wanted to do was they wanted to create some kind of schism between Joseph and the Jewish people. They wanted them to deny God, but to deny God on something that was symbolically linked to Joseph. But now, my friends, we got to ask the $1 million question. What in the world is this link between Joseph and the Syrian Greeks, between Joseph and the story of Chanukah, between Joseph and Antiochus, that there were all these incredibly strong connections? Why do I need there to be these connections? Because what do they have to do with each other? One last question. When Joseph was went to go see his brothers, and his brothers then went and threw him in the pit, the Torah tells me that Joseph was 17 years old. The Torah doesn't tell me the ages of people until they die, usually. Every once in a while, the Torah will tell me how old Abraham was, so that I can understand the magnitude of a certain event that took place. But in general, the Torah doesn't say, happy birthday, he turned 17 today. How would I care? 17 years old. It doesn't matter. You want to tell me that Yosef was young? I know Yosef was young. I know the chronology. You want to tell me that he was like immature? So you told me already he was immature. You called him a nar. You called him a child. Why was it necessary to tell me that he was 17? And then at 17, his father sent him to his brothers, which was really like sending him into the lion's den because he knew the brothers didn't love him. He goes to Yosef, he goes to his brothers to see what's happening. They take him and they throw him in a pit. Why did the Torah need to tell me 17? So I'll tell you really an amazing thing. When Yosef left Be'er Sheva to run away from his brother Esav, he, on his way to Haran, where he was going to get married and to meet his new wife, Yaakov stops. We lose him for 14 years. Now, it is a rule. Whenever you lose somebody in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshis, if you can't calculate and account for those years they're missing in their chronology, then you know that they were spending time in a place called Yeshivas Shem ve'Aver. Shem and Aver, the child and the grandchild of Noah, they set up a yeshiva, and the Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov all learned in that yeshiva. Now, Yaakov had been learning at the feet of Abraham and the feet of Isaac. What did he need 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver for? He had a doctorate already. He could have been a professor there. What was he going to learn there that he didn't already learn from Avram and Yitzchak? And according to many commentaries, he actually spent 60 some odd years of his own there beforehand. So what were these extra 14 years? What were they going to do for him? So what we have to know is that Yaakov learned all those years in safe environment, in a place where everybody believed in God, in a place where everybody was appreciative of God. Everybody had God in their lives. But now he was going to Haran. He was going to a place where there wasn't God. He was going into a hostile territory and a hostile environment. And therefore he needed to learn what's called Torah's Galus. He needed to learn the Torah of exile. He needed to learn how to live with God in a hostile setting, in a place where people are trying to remove you from belief in God, where people are trying to knock off that belief in God. That lesson was a 14-year lesson. How old is a child when we start to educate them? 3 years old. It was a 14-year lesson. Started at the age of 3, taught him for 14 years. Joseph was now 17 years old. The Torah wasn't telling me how old Joseph was because I could care less. What the Torah was telling me is that Joseph now, from the age of 3 till the age of 17, for those 14 years, he was given that 14-year message. Joseph was now armed. He was ready to go into dangerous territory. He was ready to live in a different kind of environment because he had Torah's Galus. He knew what it was like to live in an exile. And therefore Joseph was ready. And that's why the next verse of the Torah is that the Torah tells me that Jacob sent him to his brothers. And come what may, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Because even if he gets thrown away from the brothers, even if they sell him, they do something to him, it's not going to matter. He is going to be able to take care of himself because he is armed. He knows Torah's Galus. But now we have to ask the question, what really is Torah's Galus? What is this Torah of the exile? So when we're told the story of Yosef getting thrown down to Egypt, he gets down there and he gets bought by a fellow by the name of Potiphar. Potiphar puts him to work. He becomes the head of his household. Mrs. Potiphar has a fancy for him, and every single day for 10 years is trying to entice him, trying to make passes at him, trying to coerce him into having relations with her. And finally, on one day, the Torah tells us, Vayika Yom Hazeh, it was on that specific day, Vayavo Abaisa, Yosef comes to the house, and nobody else was there. Ve'ein ish mi'anshe Abayis sham b'bayis. There was nobody else there in the house. The house was empty. It was just him and Mrs. Potiphar. And he came in, La'asos Melachto, he came in to do his work. Rashi says that at that moment, Mrs. Potiphar made an advancement to him, and that she grabbed onto his coat, and he left that special coat that his father had given him. He left it in her hands, and he turned around and he ran out, and he wouldn't succumb to her enticements. Rashi says, Ba'isa Shah, at that moment, he saw the Demust Yukono Shel Aviv. He saw the image of his father in the window. And when he saw that, he realized that this wasn't the right thing to do. And he was able to muster the courage and the strength to be able to stave off and to fend off her advances. Our rabbis tell us like this, that when Yosef came into the house, what the Torah is telling me metaphorically, that Yosef, when he came down to Mitzrayim, Yosef changed his clothes. And the reason that Yosef changed his clothes is because when he came down to Mitzrayim, all Joseph wanted to do was to spread the word of God. Joseph was the son of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Joseph was from a family of people that spread the word of God everywhere in the world. And all he wanted to do was to bring it down to Egypt also. But nobody would listen to him because he was dressed like a Jew. So Joseph decided that if he assimilated, if he changed his clothes, if he looked a little different, so then he could get that message across. But he wasn't being successful. And not only wasn't he being successful, he had this challenge of Mrs. Potiphar. He came into the house, our commentaries tell us that what was he coming in to do his work? He was coming in to do his internal work. He stayed back from where the rest of the family had gone because he went to go and to introspect and to look at himself and say, what's happening to me? Why is all this happening to me? And it was at that moment that he realized that the reason that it's happening to me is because I assimilated, because I didn't pay attention to Torah's Galus. Because what Torah's Galus is how do you live in a hostile environment? How do you not assimilate? How do you not give up your values? How do you not trade in what you believe in for what other people believe in? And that's why she makes an advance on him. And Vayazov Bigdai Biyado, he leaves his clothing in her hands. He leaves his assimilation. He looks and he sees his father's image in the window. He sees Torah's Galus. He sees the lesson that he learned for 14 incredible years. And he understands, don't sell your values. Don't sell your soul to the devil. Hold on to what you believe in. Hold on to who you know you are. And it was at that moment that he realized that assimilation doesn't help. And he was able to break away from Mrs. Potiphar and all of the things that were dragging him down. That's Torah's Galus. That's who Joseph is. We call Joseph the tzaddik. We say he was a tzaddik because he was able to pull away from Mrs. Potiphar, but it was so much deeper than merely pulling away from a sexual advance. What he was able to pull away from was he was able to pull away from assimilation. He was able to pull away from losing who he was in his very essence. Our rabbis tell us that Joseph's experience in Egypt set the stage for us to be able to come down to Egypt and to live purely and to be able to not fully assimilate in Egypt. When we came down to Egypt, it says that we didn't change our names, we didn't change our language, we didn't change our clothing, we didn't assimilate. We had other issues, but we didn't assimilate when we came down to Egypt. We were protected because Yosef himself was protected. Because Yosef being sold into slavery, that's what protected us. The Ramban explains that every time you find in the Torah, and I could spend hours explaining this, but that we always find that an action, in something happens, God causes something to happen in the people, with the prophets, with the leaders. He gives them something to do, which is going to be pretentious of what's going to happen in the future. That God sets the stage for what's going to happen so that it's possible for it to happen. Joseph gets thrown into the pit, and in the pit are snakes and scorpions. In the pit are things that are dangerous to him. Is a hostile environment, is an environment that wants to only kill him and only wants to destroy him, to set the stage for what was going to happen when he actually came down to Egypt, to set the stage for what was going to happen to the Jewish people when they came down to Egypt, to set the stage for what was going to happen to us in every environment that we were ever placed in every exile that we were ever placed in. There were always snakes and scorpions. There were always things that were trying to destroy us. There were always things that were external to us that wanted us to be obliterated. And because Yosef had the strength to be able to withstand those overtures, we had the ability to be able to maintain ourselves throughout our exiles. Who was Yavan? What were the Syrian Greeks trying to do to us? My friends, what I'm going to tell you now is something that I think you all know, but it's something that needs to be reviewed and reviewed and reviewed. The Syrian Greeks were not interested in destroying the life of the Jewish people, destroying the body of the Jewish people. The Syrian Greeks were interested in darkening the eyes of the Jewish people. They were interested in taking away of la'avira mechuke ritzonecha. They wanted to take us away from keeping Torah, from living like Jews. They didn't care if we ate gefilte fish. They didn't care if we ate hamantashen. None of that mattered to them. What they wanted was they wanted to destroy the separation that existed between Jews and non-Jews. When we sing the Maoz Tzur, we're going to say a line in the Maoz Tzur, Yevanim nikbetzu alai, the Yevanim, the Syrian Greeks, they gathered up against me. And ufartzu chomos migdalai, they broke down my high towers. We understand that that's not true, that's metaphoric, because they didn't break down the towers, they didn't destroy the temple. The high towers is my mind, is my Torah, my belief in God, my soul, my spirit. And that's what they were trying to break down. In fact, there was a gate around the temple called the Chel. And they made 13 breaches in that Chel because a guy could only go up, a non-Jew could only go up to that point. He couldn't go into the temple itself. And they wanted to blur those lines. They wanted to break those lines because they wanted the Jew and the Syrian Greek to be the same. And the reason that they made 13 holes in the fence is because there are 13 divine principles, the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, the 13 principles of divine faith, of God's Rachamim, God's mercy. And those are specifically for Jews. That's specifically about the relationship that God has with the Jewish people. And they wanted to blur that relationship. They didn't care if there was a thing called the Jewish nation, but they wanted the lines that existed between the Jews and the world not to exist. They wanted us to assimilate and to blend into who they were. And they convinced Jews to do that, and those were the Hellenists. And the Jews that had Hellenized, they were also part of this whole battle of Chanukah. This was as much a war against the Syrian Greeks as it was against the Hellenized Jews. And the battle of the Chashmonaim, of the Hasmoneans, was to reinstate Judaism back in the center of the Jewish people, to reinstate living Judaism, Torah Judaism. It was to make the statement that we are not assimilationists and that we refuse to assimilate and to give up our values and to share them with anyone and to take on anyone else's values. Purim, they were trying to destroy our bodies. And that's why we celebrate Purim with drinking and with eating and with giving food to each other, with giving money to each other, because it's all about the near destruction of the body of the Jew, and therefore the Jew celebrates with the body. Hanukkah was all about the destruction of the soul of the Jew. And that's why the celebration of Chanukah is lahodos ulahalal, to give praise and thanksgiving to God. There is no real celebration of Hanukkah other than lighting the menorah. We make parties and we do all that, but there is no mitzvah of su'udah, of a meal on Hanukkah, because it's not about that. It's not about the physical destruction. And unfortunately, modern Jews have gotten their hands on Hanukkah and they talk about military victories and they talk about all of these things. If you notice, we don't talk about the military victory. There's only one time that we talk about the military victory, and that's when we say the prayer called Al Anisim in the middle of our davening. Did you ever wonder why, when we talk about Hanukkah, we talk about the miracle of the lights, but when we daven about Hanukkah, we daven about the miracle of the war? Because you can't talk about the miracle of the war, because you know what happens whenever you talk about military victories? You talk about yourself. We talk about the strength of the Jews. We talk about, look at what we were able to accomplish. Look at how powerful and mighty our army was. And that's called kochi v'yotzem yadi. That is assimilation. That's somebody else's values. My value is Hashem ish milchama. God is the God of war. God is doing all of this to me. Me'es Hashem haisazos. From God, all of this is happening. And therefore, when we're in the middle of davening, in the middle of Shmoneh Esrei, in the middle of Birchat HaMazon, in the middle of benching, it's safe to mention the war, because there you're in the context of God. But when we're in celebration mode, we celebrate the miracle of the lights, because it's too dangerous to celebrate the miracle of the war, because it leads itself to the place where just open your ears and you'll hear it every day of Hanukkah in the world that we live in. How awesome our military is. It's all about our military. It's all about God and the soul of the Jewish people. That's what Hanukkah is. You want a holiday to celebrate the military? Go make a holiday to celebrate the military. It's not Hanukkah. Don't take my Hanukkah away from me, because my Hanukkah is to remind me, do not assimilate. That's what the Syrian Greeks were trying to do to us. They were poised at destroying the connection of the Jews to Yosef, to Joseph. That's why the numerical value of Antioches and Joseph are the same, because Antioches was the antithesis of Yosef. Antiochus wanted us to assimilate. Yosef set the stage for us and gave us the strength not to assimilate. Yosef being thrown in the pit was the precursor to what was going to happen in Jewish history. It set the stage for Jewish history. Had Joseph succumbed, then his tossing into the pit would have been for naught. The atonement, the knowledge that Joseph went into that pit for something, was the proof was in the pudding years later, when we were able to walk away from that assimilation, when we were able to battle our way back into the temple and to reestablish the lights of the Torah, to reestablish the lights of Judaism, the lights of everything we held dear up until then. That's the atonement for having sold Yosef down into the pit. That's what cleansed it. It made it that it wasn't for nothing. And that's what the Syrian Greeks were trying to do. That's why it talks about oil. That it says, every time I talk about Hanukkah, I make the same joke. Imagine, the Syrian Greek army, they get into the temple. And we say that Timu Kalashvanim, they made all the oil impure. Can you make a little movie in your mind? Right? Imagine these strong starkers, these big soldiers. Boom, 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 boom. They march into the temple. They get into the temple. And the one looks at the other and says, Spartacus, yes, Leviticus, what do you think we should do now? Oh, I think that we should take our fingers and walk around the temple and stick them in all the Jewish oil and make all the oil impure. That'll really show those Jews. Well, what is that about? What does that mean, V'timu kol hashmanim, that they went after our oil? And then we searched it. We couldn't find any kosher oil. All we could find is one cruise of kosher oil. Who needed kosher oil anyway? They didn't need kosher oil to light the menorah. They could have used any oil, because they had just won a war. The temple was going to take weeks to get it ready to do the service in the temple. They didn't need kosher oil. So what's this whole story? This is the story of Hanukkah. What's the whole story? What's the purpose? Timu kol hashmanim, my friends, means that they went after the oil. They went after the soul of the Jew, because oil is something that we know that the Jews are likened to oil. Because just like oil doesn't mix, the Jews don't mix. Just like oil and other liquids, the oil rises to the top. When the Jews are placed in situations where where the goal is to try to mix them, in the end, they hold fast to who they are and they rise to the top. Oil is the symbol of anti-assimilation, is the symbol of being a proud Jew holding on to our value system. Timu kol hashmanim, they made all the shemen, all the oil impure. They tampered with the very symbol of our strength. Their objective being to get us to assimilate. But Yosef had already paved the way. He had already taught us how to hold tight to who we are and to what we believe in. And by staying true to ourselves, they were mechaper. They atoned for that sale, and they made it possible for the miracle of Chanukah to happen. And that's why the miracle happened with oil, because oil represented the strength of the Jewish people. That's what we're trying to accomplish on Hanukkah. When we light the lights of Hanukkah, we are reminded that b'chol dor vador omdim aleinu lechalosinu, that in every generation they stood up against us to destroy us. And it wasn't just our bodies that they were trying to destroy. They were trying to destroy our souls. But v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu miyadam. By staying tight and strong and loyal to God, He saved us from their hands. The remembrance of that miracle of the oil is a remembrance of the strength, the everlastingness, the nitzchius, the eternity of the Jewish people. I'm going to challenge everyone. During Hanukkah, when you light the lights and you stand in front of those lights and you're reminded of days of old, you're reminded of the strength that the Hashmonaim had not to give up their Judaism and not to give up their Jewish practices, and to be able to ensure that that stayed at the center of the Jewish people. Take a moment away from the family. Take a moment away from all the noise, from all the latkes, from all the sufganiyot, from all the presents, from all the celebrating, and just look into those lights. And spend a moment staring into those lights that represent the infinity of the Jewish soul. And ask yourself if those lights are a reflection of what's burning inside of your soul. Or are those lights the lights of someone else's value system? The lights of someone else's ethics and morals? Because that's what Hanukkah is meant to remind us. Make sure those lights are a reflection of who we really are. And that we don't give in and succumb to the daily onslaught to process, to think, to analyze, to understand the world we live in, but to understand it through somebody else's eyes and through somebody else's value system. But that we remain true and strong, that we look at what's going on to us, what's happening to us, where we are and how we exist. And we look at it through Jewish eyes, we look at it through Torah eyes, we look at it through God's eyes. And on Hanukkah, when that fire in our soul burns bright, we want to make sure it's aligned with the fire that's coming from our menorahs. And that our soul is a reflection of 3,500 years of fire, 3,500 years of illumination, 3,500 years of connection with the Master of the universe. Those are my thoughts on Hanukkah. I hope that it lights up a little bit, pardon the pun, but that it enlightens us a little bit and gives us an ability to remember, to stay, hold on to Hanukkah. Don't give it up. It's not about freedom, and the freedom. The liberals like to use it as a symbol of all kinds of freedom, that everybody, I'm okay, you're okay, and you just have to fight for what you believe in. That's not what Hanukkah is about. Hanukkah is not about religious freedom, by the way. Hanukkah is about religious rigidity, because the Chashmonaim believed in one way of living Torah, and they fought for that way till the death, and they reestablished that way inside of the Torah, inside of the temple. The Hellenists, the modernists, those that were grabbing onto other cultures and values, they were disenfranchised. They were kicked out of the temple. They were cut off from the workings in the temple and from the temple people. They had no place in Hanukkah, because that's not what Hanukkah is about. Hanukkah is about the essential flame of the Jewish people, the soul of the Jewish people. We should have the strength to be able to see that in our Hanukkah, and to be able to hold on to our Hanukkah, and to use these 8 days as days to re-strengthen ourselves and reorient ourselves and reconnect ourselves to what is really truly the essence of the Jewish people, the essence of the victory of the Jewish people, the essence of the longevity of the Jewish people, the essence of the eternity of the Jewish people. And that is our God and our Torah.